It is almost 4 years now since Te Waihanga, the Infrastructure Commission, was established. The infrastructure strategy was, of course, released last year post-COVID, but before the extreme weather events from Auckland Anniversary Weekend and Cyclone Gabrielle in February of this year. Please welcome the CEO of Te Waihanga, the Infrastructure Commission, Ross Copeland.
We got the clicker. Jack, is the clicker there, or someone going to do the slide deck? Excellent. Thank you. Kia ora koutou, ko konui te maunga, ko mataura te awa, ko Ross Copeland, toku ingoa. It's great to be here amongst infrastructure people and another building nations. And particularly the leaders that are assembled here. We're just so grateful for all the input that's gone into the infrastructure strategy. We've heard a lot of references today to Te Waihanga, the Infrastructure Commission, and I think someone was saying if there was a drinking game going and there was sort of a drink for every time we'd had our names mentioned, it'd be quite an entertaining afternoon, but it isn't one of those sessions. But I think the thing we're really excited about is the fact that so many of you contributed to the development of these recommendations, that they're landing well, and that politicians of all sides are starting to talk about how do we actually enable and deliver on some of these strategic objectives for New Zealand, how do we make it happen? And that's really what I wanted to just share a few thoughts about today. Welcome to my team as well, and also just like to say for Nick and Margaret and the team at Infrastructure New Zealand, well done on another great event, and particularly great to have Nick in the leadership role driving Infrastructure New Zealand forward. It's awesome to have that industry-government kind of relationship in really good shape again, so that's awesome. For us, there's been a lot going on. It's been a busy time in infrastructure. There's been a lot of policy work, particularly right across everything from RMA to water reform. You will have been involved with a lot of this yourselves. Certainly for us, it's always been this kind of tricky thing, particularly over the last 12 months, of what to put our limited resource in. We're only 50 strong. I think we punch a little bit above our weight. We've got some awesome people in the Commission, but it is always this issue for us of what to prioritise and what to work on. But I just thought it'd be useful to give you a sense of what we have been doing. A lot of engagement work. We've been developing a Māori infrastructure state of play, just really understanding how is the Crown engaging, where's that going well, where's it going poorly, what can we learn from the sort of 50s, 60s and 70s when we were doing infrastructure mega projects. It's been a while since we did them, and by all accounts we did some pretty weird things at that time. We got some projects done, but we can't do them that way anymore. We're trying to bring people on the journey. So that's been a really interesting piece of work. Working alongside the Accord, the construction sector Accord, I think is actually, we've heard a lot about procurement today and better client behaviour, conditions of contract that are fair and equitable. We've talked about sandpapering edges, and that certainly, I think, increasingly we're starting to see some quite good buy-in from the client side. Those of you who saw the infrastructure strategy will know that there's a really big focus on client leadership and the role that clients have in delivering better projects and better outcomes. So that's something we've certainly been pushing along. We've been trying to sort of give a voice to our work as well. So you will have seen podcasts and news releases, a lot more webinars, those types of events. Definitely give us feedback on those. We appreciate that feedback just to know if they're hitting the mark. And our symposium this year was a great event for us to get, again, good group of leaders together and understand what's going well and poorly. On the sort of project support side, our role, we have a delivery-focused team, but our role isn't to do infrastructure delivery. Our role is very much to stand back from the system, look at what's going well, what's going poorly. And a lot of what we're doing at the moment is really trying to look at some of our big projects. How are these going? What can we learn from them? Not just projects, but also programs of work. So we had a look at the health infrastructure. We've had a look at the mental health infrastructure delivery program as well. We've teased out some findings from a first review of City Rail Link. We've got a final review of Transmission Gully, which will be coming out as the project's completed once we get those final numbers. And so really just trying to understand that evidence base and then feed that back into decision making. On the strategy side, obviously the government's released its action plan in response to the strategy. There's a hell of a lot in there. Our interest in the strategy now is establishing the data and the monitoring tools that we can use to make sure it's actually happening, that the policy agencies or the delivery entities that are responsible for that right in there driving to make sure we're actually executing that. And we've seen some really good examples from around the world. Our peers in the UK, for example, are doing a great report where they're basically publishing in a very transparent and objective way, the government said it would do this, what has it actually done, have we made progress or not? That's the accountability you can expect from us when it comes to monitoring it. It's also been a pretty weird year on some other fronts. So while we were all ticking along trying to deliver our projects, we got 200 mils of rain in 4 hours. I'm not sure what the return period on that is. There's probably some sort of water and stormwater engineers in the audience who can sing out. But my understanding is that's pretty extreme, and it has a pretty significant tail in terms of the cost. It has a massive impact on our insurance markets, obviously, and the insurability of assets. But that represents a whole lot of work that we weren't planning to do that is now competing for resources. It's competing for talent and time, and it represents a hell of a lot of disruption to communities across New Zealand. So this is, I guess, the challenge for us as a group or a sector is we expect more of this. And the challenge for New Zealand is we're spending more, but we're getting a lot less for it. This is a piece of work that our economics team did going on a bit over a year ago now, and New Zealand benchmarks really poorly. You see there, we represent, in terms of infrastructure delivery performance or the amount of units of anything, metres of pavement, whatever it might be, we're roughly in the bottom 10% of developed countries or high-income countries in terms of how much capital we get per unit of capital invested or new asset. And so I guess one more data point on this actually, we did some maths, one of our economists last week sent some data over saying, I think in the last 12 months, civil construction costs in New Zealand have escalated 14%. Now, 14% in 1 year, if that continues for 5 years, that's a doubling in costs or a halving in purchasing power per unit of infrastructure delivered. That's the very tangible manifestation of what it means to have low infrastructure delivery or low efficiency when it comes to actually building things. And I guess as a country, we have a bit of an aversion to looking back at how things have gone, doing cost-benefit analysis, and I'm sort of increasingly feeling there's real frustration with the business case process as well. It's either underdone or not done at all, or it's overdone. We don't seem to have got that Goldilocks kind of piece right. Part of that, I feel, is that real lack of ex-post review, the lack of looking back and having this kind of proactive self-disclosure and real transparency around how did our projects go, what's a sensible set of metrics to evaluate them based on, and when we are then able to use those tools or those data inputs from prior projects to evaluate future investments, we can start to make some progress. But down here in little old New Zealand, despite the OECD saying this is a pretty useful thing to do, decide whether your investment represents value for money, we're still really not doing it. So a couple of things I just really wanted to talk about. There was a million different ideas rattling around my head when I was trying to put this together, and I just thought a couple of things to leave you with today. Firstly, really need to get a lot more value from the infrastructure we have. It's pretty clear there's constraints everywhere. We've got workforce constraints, we've got cost escalation, we've got new projects that are coming down the pipeline that we didn't foresee happening as a result of flood events and so on. And so we need to get a lot more from the assets we have. And the second one is we need to get better at actually choosing what we invest in when we do. So I just want to talk about those. A couple of examples. We're still talking about water metering. And we've got this whole section in the strategy that talks about technology and isn't it exciting? And I think there was a session this afternoon looking at, or it might be tomorrow, about digital engineering, and Reveal were doing some amazing stuff about as building infrastructure assets in the ground, and we're still not using water meters. Like, this is 100-year-old technology, and we're still having this debate. And it's so important that you as a community of infrastructure leaders are calling bullshit on this and saying, sorry people, but we're not having this conversation anymore. We need to get past this. The idea that we are so inefficient with water is a tremendous opportunity when you think about infill development. So for New Zealand, when you go and you start to project into the future, some of our development constraints, and if you've looked at the case for infill housing and versus greenfield and so on, you'll know that these are big challenging numbers. And you'll know that in many cities across New Zealand, one of the actual big constraints we face is this constraint around the efficiency or the availability, if you like, of capacity in existing networks. They might be water constraints, they might be electricity, But for God's sake, could we please understand what the starting point is? And that's what we're saying. This is data. We talk a lot about data. We need it to better manage our assets. It doesn't always have to translate into pricing choices, but when it does, we know we do a lot better and we're a lot more efficient with those resources. Coal-fired electricity generation, just a couple of examples here, but up over $350 a megawatt hour, I think it got to last year on the wholesale market. New generation, I think, is getting away, levelised cost of energy at around $60. We're still getting energy efficiency, which is the sort of the passive solution, if you like, away at around $15 a megawatt hour. These are really simple, no-brainer type investments. We have cold drafty homes. We've got poorly insulated buildings in New Zealand. We've got incredibly poor ventilation. We don't do building automation systems in our vertical sector as a default. It's kind of unusual. We don't do recommissioning very often. Certainly in terms of asset management and planning, we're often not looking at our mechanical systems and doing VSDs and those really low-hanging fruit initiatives and investments that get more value from the asset base. So we think there's opportunity there. There is so much opportunity in transport that we would need another conference to go through it all. But suffice to say, we're pretty excited about the opportunities that exist in transport to get a ton more value from the asset base. Pricing has a huge role to play in that. We know that there's a future revenue system review that the Ministry of Transport are looking at. We're super keen to see that brought forward, put on steroids. It has to happen sooner, in our opinion. Redeploying urban public space, like these are kind of confronting, challenging conversations, and this is why it's actually about leadership. We already know, I guess, broadly speaking, what the trade-offs are. We know what the option set is. We generally know that there's constraints, and often these are geographic. You know, if you live in Queenstown, you literally cannot expand the transport network. The corridor is between a lake and a mountain. And so we've got to make choices, and this is where the leadership piece comes in, and your role as leaders across your networks and your sectors is critical. Make submissions. You know, we don't only see, but we often see a bias in submissions to councils from people not wanting things. But we'd love to encourage you and excite you about the opportunity to make submissions in favour of things you do want to see. Transport investment is a really good example where spending more doesn't necessarily solve the congestion issue. We have this thing called induced demand. We have this pretty good modelling by ATAP that shows despite spending huge sums of money over the years to come, if we don't address some of the incentives in drivers and change the way we pay for transport access, we don't actually solve congestion. So congestion, I would like to kind of put it out there for the conference. This is the year I feel like we've been around talking to all the political parties, we've talked to ministers, we've talked to you at length. I'm yet to meet anyone who doesn't agree that 2023 is the year that New Zealand should remove the barriers to congestion charging in transport. And if you do, feel free to stand now. Thank you. I'll take that as a kind of the ayes have it. But we really are at this point where we're in furious agreement. The evidence base is unequivocal. We've had 20 to 30 years of studies. We've seen Stockholm, we've seen London, we've got New York. And little old New Zealand, we've got this tremendous opportunity to use these really basic tools. We know they work, they're instant, and we'd love to have them. So non-built solutions or getting more out of the assets we have, there's a ton of work in the pipeline, and we've talked about pipeline certainty. When you fit the 92 billion over the time frame we want to do it in to the market capacity, in other words, how much money has New Zealand ever spent in a year on infrastructure, it's clear that we won't deliver that. And that's the reason why we actually have to get more from the network we have. We just can't do it all with the capacity we have. Sure, we can grow. We saw that after Christchurch rebuild down here in the Canterbury region, that the market grew and it responded to demand. But those two things have to be in step. The next one there is it's so much faster. You can deliver these non-built solutions and immediately reap the benefits of that than spending, I think we're not being critical, but I think we're about a decade into the City Rail Link process, if you like. You know, that's a really long time. Auckland has had a hell of a lot of growth over that decade. That asset effectively is chasing to keep up with when it comes online. So these non-built solutions are fast. And we are growing again. New Zealand had 52,000, I think it was, net migration to the year ended February. So that growth is coming back. It's not because we're having more children. I think New Zealand women have got relatively low birth rate compared to our OECD averages. But we definitely, in New Zealand, we're seeing that from net migration, and that's coming back. Resilience is a thing, and it's back on the radar big time. And this kind of idea of better, more equitable, lower cost solutions, when we get more value from our networks, they're more carbon efficient, but they're also a lot cheaper to deploy. The final one there is just a bit of a reality check. We have a third lower income per capita than our colleagues in Australia, than our friends and family that might work on the other side of the Tasman. And so that third is kind of the discretionary capital in many ways. So we don't get to do everything when you have a third less income per capita. And so we've got to make some tough choices, and we've got to get more out of our assets. So better project selection, to me, starts with asset management. It starts with understanding the existing asset base. And this is a piece of work that our delivery team's been looking at. We've deliberately taken the sort of names of these organisations off this chart so that you didn't start picking on people at the afternoon tea. But suffice to say, the closer assets get to politicians, generally the poorer they perform in asset management. The further they go down the sort of autonomous, independent, economically regulated, well-governed, clear objectives, the better they tend to perform as asset management, or as asset managers, should I say. And that's a super important part of project selection. And we know when we look at a region like Auckland City and we look at the transport investment, the pipeline certainty that we've heard so much about, including from Peter, it's really important to understand for contractors and for the consultants working on these jobs, are they going to go ahead? Well, they're starting to add up. They add up to a tremendous sum of money. And you guys will remember, I was actually going to play the video because it's so cute, the Mitre 10 kids, the old Jonesy, you want to come over on the weekend? Because she is a pretty big job when you look at it, sort of $90-odd billion of transport investment. So this graph here, I don't think I have a pointer, but you can see on the left-hand side, that's the actual output of the Auckland construction market in the transport sector over the last 10 or so years. We got to a high of about 1.8 billion about 18 months ago. So that's a decent delivery. If you look at the ATAP, average annual spend that goes through for the next decade, it pretty much represents using all of that market capacity. And so the likelihood of us being able to deliver the entire bundle of projects that's sitting in that sort of medium to longer term pipeline is incredibly low. We will have to make trade-offs and choices. And other jurisdictions have done a pretty good job of this. So it's not to say you can't do this trade-off piece well. It's not to say you can't do your sequencing and your staging of your investment. We've seen a few examples from around the world. I won't labour these points, but suffice to say, if you organise that program under an umbrella structure and you have these trade-offs conversations, you do cost-benefit analysis, and you always do the best investments first, there's a really sensible way to do this and to organise those investments. So you'll remember from Building Nations last year, our minister at the time, Grant Robertson, said he was really keen to get us going on this infrastructure priority list. And we are really charging ahead on that. We've been working alongside our Treasury colleagues. I know Jeff, our GM strategy, and his team have been working really closely with Treasury, connecting, trying to work out how this fits in with the investment management system. How will it build pipeline certainty? We heard the National Party this morning giving an example of really starting to build this longer term sort of 30-year view of what types of infrastructure projects might be coming down the track, and whether we can independently and objectively analyse those to build that public confidence and bipartisan support for them, which you as a market have really been demanding. So to summarise, I guess we have been really walking backwards into the future here, and I really like this graph. This is a former staff member at the Infrastructure Commission, one of our chief advisors, Richard McGeorge, but he's doing a PhD research piece. So I sort of think about this non-built solution stuff. So if you assume that New Zealand, one of the most inefficient water consumers in the entire world, I think we're using 250 litres per person per day. Someone from Water New Zealand will correct me at the afternoon tea. But if we assume that that's the kind of rate at which New Zealand households continue to consume water, we design a really different infrastructure future, and we talk much differently about our infrastructure deficit and this infrastructure gap than if we start from the end that we would like to begin with, if you like, and we work backwards to the future we'd like to create. And so in our view, the gap is probably not as severe as we think. the gap will require a lot more objectivity, a lot more efficiency, but using these foresight tools and thinking about it in a different way is a really powerful starting point. And it goes to point one there. So we need to clearly define the infrastructure problems we're trying to solve. Once we've done that project definition, we've got real clarity about that, we need to get much more from our existing networks. Pricing tools, congestion charges, all those useful things, but also land use policies, there's a whole lot in that. Secondly there, once we decide to invest, selecting the right projects is critical. And we've talked about the basis for that project selection. We've talked about building the certainty and the cross-party support, if you like, through tools like the infrastructure priority list. And finally, when we actually go to deliver and execute these projects, the client has to be the right client. They have to be well equipped. We shouldn't have policy agencies delivering infrastructure investments. Still to this day, in New Zealand, it's happening. So we need the right institutional arrangements, we need the right governance and transparency, we need the right kinds of institutions to deliver these investments once we decide to pull the trigger. That's me, and sometimes, final kind of quote to think about there, but sometimes it's not about more concrete, it's about more courage. Thank you.
Excuse my ignorance, what are the barriers to congestion charging?
I don't know that there's that many now, Jack. So we've, in terms of around the political parties, we've talked to all sides, and there seems to be consensus that this needs to happen. We've talked to mayors, we've talked to current and former mayors of Auckland City. We've really tried to understand what those barriers might be. I think there's a perception that no one wants to speak first, that we all sort of furiously agree it's the right thing to do, but whoever goes first could be pulled down by their peers, that kind of tall poppy sort of issue potentially. But we'd just love to see this joined up agreement or consensus across the sector that we get on with it.
If done well, what would it mean in terms of efficiency and productivity gains?
I think I can't exactly quote the figures out of the congestion question report. I think it said immediate gains of something like 12% network capacity, but it is material. If you look at the build cost to deliver the equivalent capacity on the network, you're talking billions of dollars of offset cost.
Right. Heaps of questions coming in through Slido, so thank you for those. Are you concerned that National's proposed NIA will dilute Te Waihanga's mandate? And how could the entities work together? Not
at all, no. It looked to me to be quite consistent with the journey we're on as an institution. We've been really impressed with the work of Crown Infrastructure Partners. They're one part of government that's doing exceptional reporting, certainly in the oversight and the delivery work they're doing in the big programs like the shovel-ready projects and so on. They've brought some real rigour to that. They've really helped us understand how those projects are going. So first point is I really endorse this idea of the work that they've been doing, and particularly building on that capability. In terms of the work that was suggested for the Commission, that is the direction we're pulling in anyway. We want to build this pipeline certainty. We've talked about the infrastructure priority list and really trying to understand, what is that longer term view. And when we think about the RM reform and the proposed Strategic Planning Act, there's this idea that there will be spatial plans for New Zealand. Those spatial plans will require consideration of, corridors for infrastructure, long-term plans and needs, where we're going to grow, where we're going to constrain growth for another reason. It might be inundation-prone land or earthquake-prone land, for example. All of that thinking, we are starting to tune into ourselves and start to think about what happens when we do those spatial plans.
So I know you have to be relatively careful with what you say, especially this close to an election, but how much of a change would it represent for you if in 5 months' time we have a national-led government and the Infrastructure Commission's role changes?
Yeah, I reread the notes. It's always good to just read exactly what was said. So in the break, I had a look at, again, what the National Party had suggested. We don't think it's entirely inconsistent with the direction of travel anyway. We think, we wouldn't want to be getting into being an organisation that chooses individual projects, but we would certainly like to set up this great framework for objectively reviewing and assessing those projects.
How does that differ from the priority list then?
Well, so
if you're not picking winners.
It's not exactly different at all. I mean, it sounded to us like quite a similar process.
Right. But yeah, how are you not essentially picking winners as it stands there?
Well, so that process is, firstly, there is actually a panel discussion on this tomorrow, and I meant to say that. Please get along to that. It will be a really good discussion from Peter Nunn's, one of our team, is leading that. But the priority list is less about winner picking and much more about saying, what's the criteria by which we'll assess what good looks like? So we'll be publishing a document on that shortly, which will start to set out that assessment criteria. And then we'll iterate that through, obviously, with the Treasury and look to work out a process for inviting submissions.
In your experience, are you still going to come up, or are you still going to face intransigence when it comes to some of the political machinations that come that come with actually deciding on what projects get the green light?
Totally. I mean, there will always be, and it is the prerogative of the elected government of the day to decide what it wants to invest in. I think, though, what we're really encouraging governments to do, and parties of all colours, is to learn from the data. We know that economically regulated infrastructure networks are performing better. Their assets are in better condition. They have less outages. Generally, costs are in good shape. Through government policy statements and so on, we think that the government can have its cake and eat it too. It can issue these directions or system or infrastructure network outcomes, and then apply that or allow those autonomous entities to give effect to that.
A good question from the floor. How do we ensure that future infrastructure decisions work for the environment and poorer socioeconomic groups, for example, reliable public transport networks, rather than necessarily just new concrete and new roads?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a big area of focus for the Commission as well. So at the moment, we're doing our first major inquiry or deep dive topic. And that's, you might have seen, if you've been looking at our website or our LinkedIn channel, starting to consult and engage with the public around this idea of what's fair when it comes to paying for infrastructure. So we're talking about subsidies. I mean, there's broadly only three ways that we pay for infrastructure. We pay through our rates, our taxes, or user charges. And the mix and the distribution of those is obviously felt more acutely for the lower income quintiles in New Zealand. So we're really interested in understanding from New Zealanders, what do they think is fair? And then applying that into investment and pricing decision making, because too often barriers to things like a congestion price are the inability to address the social concerns around, the family who's at the margin, who needs to travel, it's peak time, and those regressive effects of pricing can be significant. So we're wanting to really front-end load our thinking on that and make sure we're designing them in a sophisticated way. On the environment, I think, certainly the work we've done and the thinking we're doing is saying infrastructure is a critical part of solving New Zealand's environmental aspirations. And actually, that's a reframe in many ways from how we've thought about it in the past. If you look at climate change, infrastructure needs to do the vast majority of New Zealand's decarbonising up to 2050, so mostly through electrification of process heat and transport. Massive environmental goal, I guess, or a BHAG for our country. If you look at our wastewater treatment decisions and the way New Zealand our aspirations for our water quality, stormwater and wastewater infrastructure are really hard to consent in New Zealand at the moment and very expensive to deliver. So we put huge barriers in the way of awesome entities, the water cares of the world, who are trying to make this happen, and we need to remove those barriers.
Just to pick you up on that first point then, since you brought up the whole congestion charging thing, what is the solution to the social inequity concerns there? Is there an elegant one?
Yeah, there is actually. So there's some examples of really successful interventions. If you look at something like the winter energy payments, that's an example of a social policy that's quite targeted. It looks at particular individuals or families that are struggling in winter, and it looks at the bigger picture from a socio-economic point of view, that if families aren't heating their homes, they're likely to consume more health services. That's likely to cost taxpayers more. So there's a really sensible intervention there, which is to help them pay that power bill. Those are the much more sophisticated interventions that we're hoping to see in transport.
How are you collaborating with other infrastructure organisations to align and comply with the RMA reform requirements and develop an environmental framework?
What was the first part? Sorry.
How do you collaborate with other infrastructure organisations?
It's been tough. Like the development of the Infrastructure National Planning Framework chapter has been full on. We've been working on it for about 12 months or so now, and we've had a range of user groups and direct engagement with Crown infrastructure providers mainly, so the likes of KiwiRail, Waka Kotahi, It's been really helpful. Transpower have been involved. So we've really tried to do it through that client lens, but we haven't had the bandwidth or the time, quite frankly, to engage directly with contractors, with the consulting sector, and that we hope will come through this Board of Inquiry process, which is next.
Does the fact that water meters are still not installed in some of our major cities give us reason for depoliticising the delivery of water services in New Zealand?
Yes.
Do you see other sectors beside water and transport where we could be getting a whole lot more out of our infrastructure?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, again, this is where economically regulated infrastructure just absolutely shines. We see, I think Transpower did some work a few years ago, and they basically said, if we didn't have this...
Politics.
No, sorry. They said if we didn't have this pricing system which discouraged peak demand on our network, we would have to build 7% more network capacity. Now, 7% of the Transpower network represents $350 million of foregone investment. So it's a really significant saving when we manage those peaks.
How do we achieve the cultural change needed in the sector to use digital tools better?
Well, partly it'll be solved by young people coming through. I think young people just have a greater affinity. They grow up on these tools. When I did my engineering degree, we had to learn how to use CAD. So there's just a fact of, over time, as the industry and the workforce changes and adapts, I think more people will be much more comfortable with using these tools. But I also think, we see in other jurisdictions things like BIM mandates, and there is a real question here for the likes of MB about whether it is time to say we need a procurement mandate to use BIM. It's unequivocal, again, the life cycle benefits of having the model to roll forward, both in terms of as built, but if we do have this idea that we want to get more than 50 years out of our buildings, for example, we need to be able to go back and reference those drawings and those designs. This whole concept of long life loose fit, where you don't know exactly what the building will be repurposed for, really relies on a good solid data set, and we need a way of storing that long term.
Alternative funding and financing and value capture have been key themes for today. I wondered if you have any reflections on the role of PPPs and if you have any work underway in the funding space.
Yeah, we do. So we published the first review on the Transmission Gully project, which really looked at the public sector comparator and the affordability threshold that was set for that project, and basically established that it was set too low. We've done quite a bit more work on the PPP model, and the final review of the Transmission Gully project, when it's able to be delivered, again, we'll really try to tease out what are some of these lessons, how can we sort of take the sandpaper to the edges of the model. There's some sort of general things that we think that the model's been criticised for that it probably are a bit unfair. Some of the COVID-related events of default that have applied to all projects, and they've caused big cost pressures on all projects, have also affected our PPP projects under delivery, but not exclusively to PPPs. So we don't sort of see any one procurement solution as a silver bullet. We think they each have their role, and I think that's pretty consistent with what we've been hearing from speakers as well today. In terms of other funding and financing tools, as a general comment, we see that there are actually a hell of a lot of tools available at local government level already. Targeted rates are a really useful example. Auckland Council's infrastructure and planning team did a great piece of work on development contributions and looking at what would it look like to actually price the true cost of growth, and I think it was the Drury development. That's something we'd really like to encourage and see a lot more of.
I appreciate the work hasn't been done yet, but are you able to give us any indications as to where the sandpaper might be applied around the edges for PPPs?
PPP model? It is that tension. So it's this idea of almost a total risk transfer contract. But ultimately, actually, we now know, and it's pretty clear, that the risk always shoots back to the Crown in these situations. If contractors are making losses, people are losing jobs, ultimately those losses somehow will sheet back to New Zealanders at large. And so we need, I guess, when we look at this and the diagnostic for why these things fail when they do, or what our definition of failure might be, it's super important that we understand you can't ever transfer all risk. There's always that residual risk piece there.
Under some policies at the moment, we're seeking to build high-density city greenfield peripheries close to cities, keeping old, low-density inner city suburbs, relatively low density. What are the infrastructure implications for that model?
There are a lot, and there's been a lot written about this. Yeah, I mean, it is a real challenge. So obviously the social fabric of cities is changing as they densify. So there's some significant social challenges. Network utilisation was one I talked about. You know, we would love to see cities understanding where they have latent capacity and can sensibly grow at very low cost, because often we perceive these barriers, but actually there's some really good network capacity there that we weren't aware of, or that other infrastructure providers perceived that their other networks may have had. So definitely, you know, it's a change. I have some personal views that I would love.
Oh, please, Ross.
I would love New Zealanders to think, I guess, much more about flexible land use policies. You know, about the idea that we don't need to impose rules and protections across all land uses. You know, we've just recently published a piece of work that compared land values across planning boundaries.
Yeah.
And we've seen exceptional growth in the value or the cost of rural land just over an urban growth boundary. And that again indicates that these rigidities in planning are causing, firstly, big supply constraints, and secondly, that if the land was, if we had competitive urban land markets, we would have less of a problem.
Thank you so much for your time, for your presentation, and for being so open to all those questions. I know many of you will want to bail up Ross outside at some point, but please join me in thanking Ross Copeland.
Thanks, Jack.